Hello everyone, welcome to the Liberian Goddess MTK. Today I am in Saint Paul, Minnesota, and I'm going to be showing you my very first mansion. I know you all clicked on this video judging from the title, but this is my very first mansion, but I do not own it, you guys. I mean, this is my very first mansion tour. This is the James Hill house in Saint Paul, Minnesota, and this beauty right here was built in the 1800s, the late 1800s. We're going on a tour. Thankfully, I have a tour guide, so she will be giving us all the details about this house. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, sit back and relax and enjoy the video.
Bill built this house in 1891 for a total cost of $931,000. He lived here with his wife Mary, 8 of their 10 kids, and a large live-in servant staff. That was very much a status symbol of the day. In fact, this entire house is a status symbol. It's built up here on the bluff, kind of like a billboard to Hill's wealth and success. So the house was built to the height of style and technology for the time. It was built with electric lights. It was built with gas lights, gas fireplaces, central heat, plumbing. There was even an art gallery which housed the 3-story pipe organ and James J. Hill's $1.7 million art collection. In total, this house is 36,000 square feet with 42 rooms, 19 bedrooms, 13 bathrooms, 22 fireplaces, and 16 chandeliers. The Hills lived here for just about 30 years. James and Mary passed away by the 1920s, and their descendants, who all had their own mansions, decided they didn't need this old thing anymore, so they gave it to the Catholic Church. You might have noticed they are still our neighbors. The Archdiocese actually used this building for a bunch of different things over the years. Used primarily for offices and bedrooms and residences, but it was also used as a school for deaf children and a teaching college for nuns. That is until 1978, when they decided they didn't want the upkeep anymore. And so that's when they sold it to us, the Minnesota Historical Society, for a whopping $250,000. Of course, we did have to put several $1 million into replacing the roof, restoring the house, basically so that we're able to give tours throughout the year today. And we do give tours throughout the year. We have different themed tours for different holidays, Labor Day, the holidays, Valentine's Day. Today we're going to kind of do the basics. We're going to go through 4 floors of the house, and we're really going to explore the stories of the people who lived and worked here. And through exploring these stories, we can maybe learn a little bit about the time in which they lived, the Gilded Age. Well, the room that we are starting in right now, folks, is a drawing room. So this is a very formal parlor. This is really where just special events and occasions would take place. You might notice a lot of wedding pictures on the walls in this room. That is because 4 of the Hill daughters actually had their weddings in here. It also has a pretty decent view, so let's go check out the windows. So we are overlooking a river valley right now. The trees and the buildings would have been a lot shorter back when this house was built. But the river running through St. Paul is pretty important. Does anyone know what river? Mississippi. You got it, Mississippi River. Now in a time before railways and a time before highways, it was the waterways. So the rivers, the lakes, the streams, the seas, which is really how you moved people and stuff from one place to the other. And the Mississippi's a pretty important one. This area was actually the furthest north you could get on the Mississippi on a boat. Because if you got any further north than this, you hit Minneapolis, which was basically made of waterfalls. So this area is the height of navigation on the river. So that's why the city of St. Paul grew up here, around the river economy, around the river traffic. One of the people who ends up here is a young, fresh-faced James J. Hill. He's not born here. He was born on a small farm in Ontario, Canada in 1838. When he was 14, his father passed away. So that meant he had to quit school, he had to go to work, he was the head of the family, had to support them. He worked as a clerk in his hometown for a few years. Before at age 17, he decided he was going to go west. He was going to go seek his fortune. He was going to go as far as China and Japan. And he made it to St. Paul. Don't worry too much about him, though. There was a lot of opportunities. This is kind of the Wild West. This is before Minnesota was a state. And there were a lot of jobs on the Mississippi, especially for someone like Hill. He already had advantages because he knew how to read and write in English. And man, was his handwriting good. So he was able to get a job as a clerk on the Mississippi. And he turns out he was really good at working at the shipping industry. He worked his way up through the shipping industry pretty steadily. He was very detail-oriented and very reliable. So by the end of by the 1860s, he's become shipping agent, which he is during the Civil War. And then by the end of the 1860s, he sets on his own. He builds his own warehouses on the Mississippi. He ends up with his own fleet of steamboats. By the time he's just about 35, 40 years old, Hill's doing pretty well. He's got his fleet of steamboats and his shipping companies on the Mississippi, eastern border of Minnesota. He's not even 40. He's doing real well. All right, you ready to go?
Sure.
All right, let's head upstairs. Alrighty, folks. Welcome to the Victorian equivalent of a master suite. We're looking at two separate bedrooms here, one for James and one for Mary. So each of them had their own beds, their own fireplaces, their own bathrooms, their own closets. Now, the biggest reason for two of everything, they could.
Yeah.
Now, another major reason was propriety. Both of them would have had their own personal servants to help get dressed and undressed every day, and you don't want your lady's maid to see your husband in his pajamas. So they have a pocket door here. Privacy. The biggest bedroom in the house belongs to Mary Hill. As James J. Hill himself said, "To the support and loving patience of my wife, I owe more of my success than to anything else." Unfortunately, her father passes away pretty young as well, and by the time she's a teenager, she is also working. She's working at the Merchants Hotel in downtown St. Paul as a waitress. But before they get married, Mary has a lot to think about. She is a very devoted Catholic, and James J. Hill is not. So she actually talks with her personal priest. This is Father Louis Calais, kind of like a father figure to her. And he knows Hill's reputation already, and he says, he's doing really well. And he says, he's going to do better. So he encourages the marriage, but he says, you should maybe go to school. So he encourages Mary to go to finishing school, because if Hill's going to become a millionaire, there's a lot you need to learn as the wife of a millionaire. So she goes for 3 years, and she's of course going to learn things like manners and French and needlepoint, and that's one of her finishing school projects over there. Pretty nice. But she's also learning budgeting, mathematics, staff management, letter writing. She is learning how to plan for events and travel. She does that for 3 years. They get married in 1867. Now the Hills then pretty quickly go on to have a family of 10 kids. 9 of their children survive to adulthood, so this is a painting of the 9. Now, they also start building bigger and grander houses. As Hill's fortunes grow, they build them both here in St. Paul and elsewhere. This painting is of their farmhouse in North Oaks, Minnesota. If you're at all familiar with the Twin Cities suburbs, the suburb of North Oaks was their farm. The whole thing. Yeah. Now, James J. Hill never converts to Catholicism, but you bet all 10 of these kids are baptized Catholic.
Yeah.
Now, their mansion, before they built this mansion, was this house right over here. This was here in St. Paul. It was on 9th and Canada in Lowerton. Unfortunately, this house is no longer there. James J. Hill himself knocked it down and used the materials to build his stable house just a couple of blocks away. This house is their last house, which they built in 1891, so it's not their starter house by any stretch of the imagination. We're here in James J. Hill's bedroom. We're kind of catching up with him. One of the things, folks, you might notice in the house today, we are missing a lot of the beds for the bedrooms. Now, the biggest reason for this is that when the Hill kids donated the house to the church, they kept most of the bedroom sets. But we are pretty lucky to have a lot of historic pictures in the house, so keep an eye out for those. You can really see what these spaces look like originally, kind of use your imaginations. Now, we might not have his bed, but we do have a place where he'll spend more time, I think. This is his desk from his downtown office. James J. Hill was a notorious workaholic, and this started pretty early. Here's a story from when he and Mary first got married, so you'll please have to imagine that I look like that guy. I often worked in my office until 1 in the morning. One night, my wife said she would go to the office with me and bring me home at 10:30. It was a summer night, and I gave her a book and a chair by the window, where she presently fell asleep. At 2, I wakened her and took her home. So what's he doing? Well, he would be 100% what we would call today a micromanager. He is always looking at things like numbers and wages and prices, but he's also someone who did his homework. He would be always doing research on what the latest new things were in transportation and technology. And by the 1870s, this is after the Civil War, that's going to be railroads. Railroads are the new thing in shipping. Everyone's buying them up, building them out. But unfortunately, most people aren't doing it very well. They are taking it as an opportunity up front, and they are going bankrupt when they can't make it work. They're building it with terrible materials. They're building them in places you can't make money, like through deserts. So there was actually even a bankrupt railroad here in town. And so right over here on this map, you can see in the red, was the Saint Paul and Pacific. It's got a great name, but it only went as far as Breckenridge. So James J. Hill sees this as an opportunity. He throws all that money he's already earned from his shipping businesses and convinces 4 other guys to do that. They buy up this railroad, and Hill's plan is to move the spur line up to the Red River Valley. Hill knows it already. He's got steamboats running on it. And the Red River is pretty important. Now, according, it's supposedly the second most important north-running river in the world. The first, of course, being the Nile, so I'm not sure about that. But it's pretty important. It runs north to Canada and Hudson Bay, which is a really important port. But what you can't really tell from this map is this chunk here is actually really terrible for boats. It doesn't go straight, it goes like this. It's shallow, it's muddy, it's narrow, you can't use it part of the year. So by bringing the railroad up that way, it's then able to be much more reliable and earn way more money. And it is phenomenally successful. So much so that Hill's able to get his money back pretty much right away. And then the rest is kind of history, because he and the other investors, they put more money into the railroad, they build up and buy up more little spur lines to connect to it. Hill's initial plan is to continue into Canada. But Canada said, you know, we have our own railroad. I assume. So James J. Hill decides basically to build his own. So he's building what he calls the Northern Route, which is why they end up calling it the Great Northern Railway. Now, James J. Hill has now become a president of one of the biggest companies in the United States. He's one of the biggest employers in the United States. So he's up here, but he's still down there looking at prices and wages. He will run into one of these small towns on his private rail car. He'd sometimes help out the workers, picking up a shovel or a hammer to help out. But of course, then sometimes he'd fire people on the spot. And then fire anybody who complained about it. This railroad finishes out to Seattle in 1893. So that made it a transcontinental railroad. It isn't the first. There are a couple more in the US and in Canada. But what these railroads are doing is kind of changing everything out west. They're changing, of course, who lives out here, but also how quickly you can travel, move things like food and other products. But they're even changing little things, because they have to be on time at all those little stops. So this is when things like time zones are implemented. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about next, is sort of the impact of these railroads on the West. So, any questions after my whole little speech? So one of those things is this punch bowl here in the middle, because I know we all have punch bowls with our faces on them. This one has 2. We've got Young Hill and the warehouses on the river. And then this side we have sort of classic Hill and the railroad map. So this is kind of his whole St. Paul career. This was given to him by the city in 1893 when the railroad was completed. They held a 3-day party to celebrate. They closed businesses, they held parades. This was a huge deal. James J. Hill was kind of a hometown hero. He also managed to do this without going bankrupt and causing a nationwide recession. That is what other transcontinental railroads have done, so good on Hill. However, Hill and other railroad barons and railroads were not popular everywhere. Railroads were America's first big business, so they had more power, more wealth, controlled more jobs than any other businesses had done beforehand. So if Hill messes with prices or wages, that impacts a lot of people. And he'd actually be involved in several labor struggles through the years. Some pretty important ones too. One which actually ended up creating today's Labor Day holiday. Now, as the railroads move west, They also displaced the native populations that lived in those areas and brought in whole new people to farm along the railroads. That's often how they would make their money. But those farmers didn't necessarily like the railroads either, because the railroads controlled the price of their land, the price of their crops, even the wages in the towns they lived in. So out in Montana, there were farmers and ranchers that lived along hills lines, and in their crops grew stubborn, grubby weeds that they ended up just calling Jim Hill. Now, there actually, frankly, weren't enough people on the East Coast for the amount of land that the railroads were wanting to fill. So the railroads actually got involved in European immigration. They ran bureaus of immigration in cities like London, places like Germany and Sweden. And if you went to the Bureau of the Great Northern in Germany, you bought the whole package. Your land in America, which you'd never seen or heard of before. You gotta hope that North Dakota's good. You get your railroad ticket to get to North Dakota, and then your steamboat ticket to get to America. Now folks, if you are taking a steam train or steamboat, you need some luggage. So over here I have 2 steamer trunks. And while these 2 trunks are here at the Hill House, both of them were also both headed to New York City in 1896. But they were both coming from 2 different directions and 2 whole different worlds. This one you can see Saint Paul, Minnesota with a big H on it. That belonged to the Hill family, specifically Rachel Hill. She was one of the Hill's younger daughters. That year she's 15 years old, living in her bedroom just down the hallway with her sisters. Their servant staff packs her fancy dresses into this Louis Vuitton steam trunk. And she goes first class to Miss Peebles School for Girls in New York. Time for her to go to finishing school. Now this trunk here, this is a bit cheaper. This is gonna be heavier, and it belonged to another teenage girl. Her name was Lena Peterson. She was 17 years old, living in Småland, Sweden. On the other hand, she packed everything she owned into one trunk to go down a crowded steamboat to immigrate to Ellis Island, New York, the exact same year by herself. Lena was not unique. There were a lot of single women traveling from Europe too for new opportunities here in America. But their opportunities looked a lot different if you were a woman. One of the most available jobs was working as a domestic servant in a large house like this one. Lena got a job as a cook's maid in New York City. But a house like the Hill House could not exist without their large staff of servants. So that's actually what we're going to check out next. We're going to head to the back staircase to check out the servants' hall on the 3rd floor. Alrighty, folks, welcome to the 3rd floor. Now at this time, basically, once you reach middle class, or as soon as you could afford it, you wanted to pay somebody to do things like your cooking and your cleaning and your laundry. For one thing, it was a big time saver for the female members of your family, and it was a status symbol. The wealthier you were, the more people you could afford to pay. The Hills have a very big staff. They had up to about 15 people, depending on the time of year. Now, they live in the northern United States, so the majority of their servant staff will be living with them. Majority of them would have been women, and the majority of them would have been from immigrant families, 1st or 2nd generation. Now, this wing up here is just for the women. So there are 5 bedrooms here, which about 10 ladies could share, a couple of big workrooms, and then 1 bathroom back here for everybody. The male servant staff had their bedrooms way downstairs in the basement. Now, because you have a different class living with you, there was a lot of anxieties about this. So they actually put a lot of rules and regulations on these jobs. For example, you were required to be unmarried, and you also had a tight curfew. They didn't want you out carousing. They wanted you back here at a certain time. This is on top of jobs where you're working 15 to 17-hour days. You're working 6 to 7 day weeks. And while this is one of the most highly paid jobs available for women, that doesn't say a lot. So people actually tended to not work in these roles for a long time. They would work for a few years, get some money, and leave to get married. A very common story. But sometimes they'd also leave for other jobs. A factory job might pay less, you wouldn't get room and board, but it did give you more freedom over your spare time, which was incredibly valuable. The upper class, especially the women, did not understand this. they kept running into what they called the servant problem. They had a lot more jobs than people were willing to fill. So they would write all sorts of newspaper articles and magazine articles, basically trying to figure this out. And so that's where a lot of quotes like this come from. Basically, these articles boil down to, why won't anyone work in our service industry anymore? Which sounds very familiar to me these days. Now, and when you are as wealthy as the Hills, you can afford not just to have one person who does everything. You can afford to pay a little bit more to have someone with higher status, higher skills. So you can afford to have a head cook, for example. And what the Hills paid for are some seamstresses. So they had to have some dressmakers. Because, you see, they had a lot of daughters. They also had apartments in New York and Paris. So these girls are in high society. They have to wear the latest of fashions and styles. So sometimes their dressmakers even came with them on their trips. Now, this is one of the Hill daughters. This is Charlotte. She, for a while, actually kept kind of a scrapbook where she put the dresses that she wanted the seamstresses to make for her, even with fabric samples. We can tell these ones are from the 1890s because of the sheer size of the sleeves. They're like linebackers. Now, this is one of the seamstresses who worked here. This is Tilly Isaacson. She worked here between 1900 to 1903. In that year, she left to get married. But as a wedding present, Mary Hill gave her the Hill's old sewing machine. Don't worry, they got a new one. Now, folks, you can really tell that this space is very different than the bedrooms and the public areas. Even the woodwork is different. It's not as carved, but it's also made from a different wood. It's made from local, cheap pine. There is a staircase that goes up to the attic, which is kind of a huge wood-paneled space. It's pretty plain, and the most they used it for was a playroom for their kids and then later their grandkids. But this changes. So here we have, on this side of the door, the local cheap pine in the servant side. When we head to the family space, we have a beautiful quarter-sawn white oak from New Hampshire. So that is even in the door frame here. We're gonna head to the room on the right here, folks.
Are these grandkids or?
A little bit of both. These are daughters when they're young. These two are grandkids. Yeah, daughter, grandkid, daughter, yeah, a little bit of everything. So with this chalkboard here, what do you guys think this room might have been used for?
Schoolroom?
You got it. At least their younger kids, they were taught at home in a classroom with a live-in tutor. Now here on the chalkboard you can see all 10 of the Hill kids. When they moved in here, they actually only built 8 bedrooms. They had lost Katie as a little girl, and then their oldest, Mary, she's already married. She actually has her own kid, and the Hills are already grandparents when they move into this house. Their youngest was Walter, who was just about 6 when the family moved in. Now these kids end up having a very different life than their parents. James and Mary, they both come from working class families. They were both working by the time they're teenagers. These kids, though, they get the best education money can buy. They're taught at home. They're with tutors. They go to fancy boarding schools. Then the boys are expected to attend Yale University, and the girls, the best finishing schools. And then after that, their lives are basically set. The boys are basically handed jobs in Hill's businesses, and the girls, they're introduced to a variety of eligible bachelors. They end up marrying lawyers, bankers, other railroad executives, and a doctor. Now, then they're also world travelers. They're going all over the US, Europe, some of them even do make it to Asia, like their dad dreamed of doing. And they're also socialites. They're rubbing elbows with some of the most famous and wealthy families. But they're going to all these big parties, and they're also hosting them. And frankly, that is why you build a house that's this big. It's, yes, to show off to the little people in St. Paul, but it's also as an event center, essentially. So that's what we're gonna do next. We are gonna head all the way back down to the first floor to check out those public party spaces downstairs. This is a house that's really built for entertaining, for having massive parties and events. So this isn't just the grand hallway, it's actually used as the ballroom too. So for these big parties and events, these big front doors would be wide open here for guests. They're gonna come right on in, just like we all did today. There, if you have blankets, because your carriage might be very cold, those go in that big chest right there. If you have your coats, those are gonna go in the coat room, where you might have put yours today. And then the gentlemen are ready to party, but not the ladies. If you look back this way, there is a side door in this vestibule that heads up to a back staircase. So the ladies would head up that way. There would be maids available to help fix their hair, put on some dancing shoes, and then you make your grand entrance down the staircase. Not a bad way to enter a party. But for them, this was really serious business. The same people that they're partying with, these are the same families that they're doing business with. So the gentlemen have their names on the businesses. Let's have it this way. So the wives, for example, they've got their calling cards like this. And so they're going to bring those and visit parlors like these big mansions. They're basically creating a social network with each other. And then the young adults are hoping to make marriage matches. So hence the grand entrances down the staircase. Now after an evening event, you hope that business will actually be discussed, and that would be in a place like the library. All right, everybody, welcome to the library. Now you can see Mr. Hill once again above us. By the time Hill owns this house, he's involved in a lot of stuff, not just shipping and railroads, but think everything that you can ship. So iron ore, coal, lumber, wheat, cattle. He's got a newspaper. He owns a bank. Basically, you want to be in here doing business with him. He's got his den, his own private office here at home. That's a great space to check out after your tour today. Now, during the rest of the week, this room served more like a family room for the Hills. This is where you're going to find James and Mary, so Grandpa and Grandma, sitting in front of the fire. You might find Mary writing in her diary, the Hill kids playing cards or putting together puzzles. And you would find the whole family reading. It is a library, and they loved to read. Not great for reading. That is very true. Now, they are coming up from candlelight. So for them, this isn't quite as jarring, but they did have a sort of backup system. One of the jobs of the maids in the evenings would be to come into rooms like this one, they close the drapes, and then light the gas lamps. So those are here in the center. Those are going to give you a brighter, glowing light to read by. And unfortunately, it isn't natural gas like we would use today. It's coal gas. So that is smelly and sooty. So after the family turns in for the night, the maids have to come back into this room and scrub the walls. Whoa. We have to remember that as beautiful and comfy as all these rooms seem, they're also all working spaces for the staff here. All the carpets have to be cleaned, the walls scrubbed, the shelves dusted. If you're lucky to have the high status jobs, like the head cook or those seamstresses working upstairs, then you get to wear your own dress. But if you're one of the maids working the main levels, that's when you wear the uniform. Because you're almost supposed to blend in. You're what a family like the Hills is trying to express, that they can afford a big house like this, and they can afford the staff to keep it up. But if the Hills really want to impress their guests, then they have a dinner party.
Wow.